Thank you all for coming. It's odd to be in the front of the room. I usually sit way in the back so I can doze off unobserved. It's going to be embarrassing if I doze off. First of all, the first slide that you see up there, if you've been paying attention, that's not exactly the title of the talk. The title of the talk is The Bones of an Opinion, and I'll get to that a little later. But what I want to talk about first are the pieces that we call the Quarry Farm Marginalia. And just to orient you, for those of you who don't know, that's a picture of the farm from about 1900. And this is the front parlor. Now, when the college received the gift of the farm in 1982, the property had been in the possession of the Langdon family from the time it was purchased by Jervis in 1847. And although the house had been enlarged, remodeled, and modernized, much of it remained as it had been during the visits of Sam Clemens and his family between 1871 and 1889. And one feature that remained for the most part intact was this front parlor, which looks very much the same now. And if you notice the bookshelves to the left of the fireplace, and there's another set of bookshelves on the other side of that doorway, that library was more or less intact and as it had been when Twain visited. When those books were examined, it was discovered that there were books in that collection that had Mark Twain's annotations in it. And they were brought down to this room. This is the Mark Twain archive on campus in the library where I work. The books that were in the parlor are now in those glass cases. And what I'm going to be showing you is open to the public. If you want to make an appointment, come down and actually see the things that I'm showing you examples of tonight. You just need to make an appointment, and that's possible for anybody. First thing I want to start with is a set of Macaulay. There were at least two sets of books at Quarry Farm by Macaulay, and one in particular, The History of England from the Accession of James II, was cited by Joe Fulton in his book, The Quarry Farm Marginalia. And it's influential to Clemens' thinking as he worked on Connecticut Yankee. There are a couple of things to notice about the Macaulay. The first thing to notice about any of these books is that they didn't belong to Mark Twain. The books he was writing in were always somebody else's books. And in this case, this set belonged to Theodore Crane. There are a couple of things that are typical in this example of what you find with Twain's Marginalia. First of all, he's correcting Macaulay. Macaulay is talking about a deluge. Let me find my own copy. Being entombed under a deluge. And Clemens correctly corrects that to engulfed. He figures you can't be entombed under a deluge. He admired Macaulay. He talked about Macaulay's stately sentences, and he read Macaulay over and over, but that didn't stop him from always being an editor. The other thing to notice about this that's typical, and I lose credibility at this point always, because Twain used a purple pencil. And people think, oh yeah, right, sure, Twain used a purple pencil. But he did. Sometimes I think he's still making jokes from beyond, but he did use a purple pencil. And in this second example, you can see that he's talking about the difference or the distance between Dover and Calais, and he's saying 25 miles apart, and he's marked off that little section at the top. But I don't know if this is clear on the slide, but that's actually in black pencil. And when Joe Fulton was working on this, he was using, and other scholars have done this as well, using that difference in inks or pencils to tell you what period of time Clemens was working. And that purple pencil has been dated to 1885, so the work that Clemens was doing in 1885 can be directly traced to some of the marginalia that I'm going to be showing you. The interesting thing is that you can tell that he went back in certain places and reread the same passage, and in some places corrected it at a later time. And Fulton has traced some of that to 1887, just based on what he was working on, what he said about Connecticut Yankee in particular. So Macaulay wasn't quite as influential as this person. William Edward Heartful Leckie was a thinker who was very important to Twain's thought. Twain was known to have read Leckie over and over. There are other sets of the same books in other collections across the country with Twain's writing in them. So he reread Leckie a number of times, but he particularly read it, and it particularly influenced his work on Connecticut Yankee. This set is called England in the 18th Century. It belonged to Theodore Crane again. Clemens marked, according to Fulton, he's figured out that the C's have to do with the church. So whenever Clemens found a passage that reminded him of or suggested something about Christianity or the church, he put that little C in the margin. The interesting...
Sorry.
The larger comment on the side, give me a second. And he's got two passages marked off, as you can see, and his commentary is, this is one tribe of Christians straining at a gnat. On page 18 you see their brothers swallowing a camel without difficulty. On page 18 they're talking about an organization that called the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel, who was sending missionaries, but they also owned slaves and wouldn't allow the slaves to have religious instruction. And on the other page he's talking about Christians in the United States who are worried about swimming on the Sabbath. So I'm drawing the distinction between forms of Christianity. And this kind of criticism of the church runs through a lot of the marginalia that you're going to be seeing. And Twain's irritation with what he sees as hypocrisy, basically. And this is another commentary about witches being burnt in Scotland. As late as 1678, no less than 10 women were condemned to the flames on a single day. And he says within 15 years of Salem that they find so much fault with where nobody was burnt. So, and witchcraft comes up, as you probably know, quite a bit in Connecticut Yankee as well. This is another book by Leckie. This set belonged to Susan Crane, as you can see. And here's another one of the typical purple commentaries that Twain has made. And what that says is, think a moment, weigh well the meaning of those 8 lines. They mean that the entire world, wise and simple, believed for ages in a thing, sorcery, which had absolutely no existence. Now the rest of that, he's crossed out in such a way that you can't possibly figure out what he was trying to say. And that's another thing that you'll see typically. Even though this was Susan Crane's book, and he was up here for the summer, and he made this comment, he thought better of it and corrected it and didn't want anybody finding it and reading something he didn't intend. You know, he didn't get it just right. So he often corrected his own marginalia. And we didn't, we didn't see these until 1982, but there's a sense of audience there that is kind of interesting. And I kind of tried to enhance that a bit. You can see a little bit better the way that he's... And Joe Fulton, when he was working on this, spent a lot of time trying to figure out what was underneath that. And you just can't, you really can't figure it out. This one is a similar thing. It's in a chapter on magic and witchcraft, and the commentary on this page is, there are people even in this day who long for a united church. There never was a united church which did not usurp the privileges of tyranny. He's crossed out what he originally said, and he's written tyranny in pencil, black pencil. So the speculation is that he did the first comment in 1885, went back and read his own comment, probably in 1887, and corrected it. And in this case, we could figure out what was underneath that, and it said hell. So the original thing was, there never was a united church which did not usurp the privileges of hell. So when he went back and read that again, he thought better of it. It may have been for Susan Crane's sensibilities. I'm not sure why he decided that was a little too strong, apparently. So those were earlier sets. This is another set. And in this set we have evidence of Clemens struggling with matters of morality, determinism, and God. Those are lifelong concerns that became more overt in his later work, and they helped fuel that common notion of Clemens as a dark, atheistic misanthrope, and how embittered he was by the tragic events in his life. That's a common way of seeing him at the end of his life. We'll see some other examples that help complicate that view a little bit, but this set was published in 1902, which means that Clemens was reading it and annotating it in 1903 on his last long visit to the farm. And the comments in this actually give strength to that picture of Clemens as kind of embittered and railing at God. This page 5 passage, he's responding, and he says, a desire to obtain happiness and to avoid pain is the only possible motive to action. The reason and the only reason why we should perform virtuous actions, or in other words, seek the good of others, is that on the whole, such a course will bring us the greatest amount of happiness. That's what Leckie says. Excuse me. Clemens strikes out the part about seeking the good of others. And then he writes in the margin, thus corrected, it is sound and true. And on this page, Leckie in his footnote says the morality of God is generally different from the morality of men. And Clemens' comment says, it's pretty evident that God is a white elephant on these people's hands. For different, read worse. So the morality of God is generally worse than the morality of men. And page 21, again, he says, we are totally indifferent to another's pain except when the spectacle of it gives us pain. Otherwise, we care not a rap for it. And there's a picture of Clemens and Livy on the porch that summer in 1903, and it was not, Livy was sick, Susie had died. He was in that period where things weren't so great, and you can kind of see that in that picture. And that's the time during which he would have been reading and writing in these volumes. Carlyle was very important to Twain. This set also belonged to Susan. It's a 2-volume set of the French Revolution. Clemens expressed a lot of admiration for Carlyle. He wrote that he had a reverent affection for Carlyle's books and read his Revolution 8 times. He said that in 1899. He first read it as early as 1871. Albert Bigelow Paine reported that Clemens often turned to Carlyle, and it's widely believed that Clemens' own copy of the French Revolution was at his bedside when he died. Joe Fulton again specifically tied the Marginalia and Crane copy of the book to passages in Connecticut Yankee. And there are a bunch of annotations in here, but this is the thing I think that's on the front of the program. And he tells us when he finished it. He finished reading it September 10th, 1888. And he does a lengthy critique, having just finished reading the French Revolution for, God knows, the fifth time or fourth time or something. And I'm going to read you the whole thing. This is what it actually, closer to what it really looks like. This is, I kind of try to enhance this so you can get an idea. And again, he's got some cross-outs. He didn't quite get it the way he wanted it, so he's crossed things out. And again, we couldn't figure out what's underneath there. But let me read you what he says. This is a picture of the French Revolution, but in only a limited way. A history of it. It's as if one gave you a picture of God manufacturing by tedious and long processes hair, bones, flesh, nails, nerves, muscles, tendons, and piling them in separate piles and adding a bucket of blood and stopping there with the remark, such was the process of the creation of man. Now what use were that, except he set up man and let us look at him and see if he was better or worse than this chaos and rubbish he was made out of. The revolution had a result, a superb, a stupendous, a most noble, and a sublime result, to wit, French liberty, and in a degree, human liberty, and was worth 1,000,000 times what it cost of blood and terror and various suffering and titanic labor. And this fair and shapely creation was not worth Carlyle's pains to paint. Nothing but the process interested him. The result was a matter of indifference. He should have given a chapter showing what French laws were before the Revolution and what they were when the Revolution's work was finished. So, again, he really admired Carlyle, but that didn't stop him from telling you what he thought after that particular reading. And that's just the last page. Browning, the copy that we have of Browning is 2 volumes of a 6-volume set, and it belonged to Livy. And Clemens was known to have read Browning at households in Hartford, and he was also known to have done a reading, at least one reading of Browning here in town at the home of John Stanchfield. And Gretchen Charlow did a paper about Clemens' reading at the Stanchfield house in 1888. So this may have come with them from Hartford. We don't have the other 4. I'm not sure if they have them in Hartford, because a lot of those books were dispersed. But what you can see, this is the table of contents. He's marked a couple of them, and this is one of the pages that he's marked for public reading. So he would, perform this in somebody's living room, basically. And you can see the exclamation marks. He's crossed some things out. He's got stress marks, whatever they meant to him, that helped him read. And down below he said scorn. And right down there where it says, your camels go gaze on them, he's changed it to, you go gaze on them. I don't know what Browning would have thought of that. And this is actually the first page of the poem. It's a poem about it's an Arabian horse that gets stolen. It's a dramatic poem. And he's written about 15 minutes, so he knows how long it's going to take him to read it. Not loud. So he's gone to a lot of trouble to prepare this poem so that he can present it properly. And a lot of the people that I show this to, or classes, they've bought into the image that Twain projected of himself as being kind of off the cuff, aw shucks, ambling out on stage and just talking to you conversationally. And in fact, a lot of work went into that persona. So this kind of shows his sense of his stage sense, I think. And you can see the scorn a little bit. Dickens, this is the set that Tom mentioned. We have a set of Dickens. It's a 42-volume set that belonged to Theodore Crane. And of these, 19 have some sort of markings or notations by Clemens. This is particularly interesting because Clemens tried to downplay any awareness of Dickens or any particular interest in Dickens. And he kind of said, well, he didn't really care for Dickens. He didn't really read him that much. But in fact, he did. I mean, there are other sets around that have his markings in them. The sets, the 19 volumes that we have now down at the library, have clear evidence that he was pretty interested in Dickens. Howard Bateshold, who some of you may remember, theorized that Clemens' denials had to do with his public image as a self-taught and anti-literary man. It's also clear that from some of the other pieces we have that Clemens, when he was dealing with other writers of fiction, he was more comfortable with those that didn't present any kind of a threat. He liked writers he thought were worse than him. That was more fun for him to read than people that might present some kind of rival. But one of the volumes that he's marked in is The Old Curiosity Shop. This is on page 22. I'm not familiar with The Old Curiosity Shop, but whoever the character is he's talking about, he says, I suppose the old miscreant's going out to gamble now. And this is a really interesting page. Dickens has done this description of people crossing a bridge and looking down into the water, and some of them are, if I could get a great sense of peace from that, and somebody else is thinking about maybe jumping in and killing themselves. And Clemens has done this lengthy piece around the side. He says, this is that luxury of life, that dreamy, undefined longing that comes with the early spring, a yearning after tranquil islands and lonely seas, balmy airs, the lullaby wash of wavelets upon some faraway shore, yearning whose desire is heaven, really, though the soul does not know it. And I showed this to one scholar years ago, and they speculated that Clemens was making fun of Dickens' flowery language. But I don't really get that at all. I mean, Clemens is very capable of writing that kind of strong, descriptive, heartfelt passage when he feels like it. And I think that's what he's doing in that particular spot. The other volumes that he's written in, as Tom mentioned, is, again, Tale of Two Cities. The French Revolution keeps coming around in Clemens' work. On this page, he says, Dickens deliberately meant this poor stuff to be funny, and as he did not expunge it, it stands to reason that he thought it was funny. And on this page, he says, it's a noble book. It's a pity it's degraded and disfigured by this Jared's silly presence. So he's very, whereas as in the other books, the historical books and the philosophical books, he's carrying on more of an intellectual dialogue. When it's another writer of fiction, he's being more of an editor and a critic. And actually, Tale of Two Cities was one of the Dickens pieces that he did not deny having an interest in and having read. So it was well known that he did have some admiration for Tale of Two Cities. Again, that French Revolution, he was fascinated by the French Revolution. So that ends what I brought to show you of the Quarry Farm Marginalia. But we have some other things in the collection. This is a book, Irene Langdon gave us this book in 2008. It's a book called Tent Life in the Holy Land. And Irene still had it in her possession, and she was kind enough to give it to us. It's a book that was recommended reading for travelers on the Quaker City voyage, and it belonged to Charlie Langdon. And that's the trip on which Clemens met Charlie, and Charlie showed him a picture of Olivia, his sister, and then subsequently Twain came to Elmira and married Olivia. So it was just stayed in the Langdon family and was Charlie's copy. When Irene called me, she said they had this book of Charlie's and would we be interested in it. And when I went up and looked at it, I realized that it was Charlie's copy, but once again, Clemens was the one who'd been doing all the writing in it. So the interesting thing about this book is it was known to be influential as source material for Innocents Abroad, and it was a book that Twain really disliked as a type of literature. It was an example of Holy Land literature that was very it was of a type that fired people up and gave them a sense of entitlement to the Holy Land. It was very kind of culturally obnoxious, and Twain really resented that about it, and how it was influencing especially the people on the trip. William Prime was most well known as an art historian. He was a professor at Princeton, and he practiced law and served as the president of the Associated Press. But as a young man, he traveled and wrote about his travel experiences. And this you can see Charlie Langdon's signature, and that's the young Charlie Langdon and Clemens. This is Prime. So he had quite an interesting self-image. And Clemens couldn't stand this guy. So this, early on in the book, you see down in this corner, Clemens' comment is, always picturesque, always an ass. And you kind of just look at that picture of Prime, kind of get that feeling. And up here, up on the right, he's marked off, went in without killing anybody. Prime was always making these dramatic. He didn't really kill anybody. He always was waving his revolver around and riding his horse. Clemens just thought it was ridiculous. This is interesting. This is unintentionally funny. This is typical of Prime. He says, he's talking about people in Egypt, I think they are. But the vandalism that thus destroys relics of the ancient days, none can more thoroughly detest and condemn than do I. But where I find such antiques fast disappearing before the hands of the vandals, I'm not so foolish as to refuse to take what I can. And I therefore borrowed a hammer and chisel of Antonio. So, and Clemens' comment to that is the customary excuse of the thief. This is a passage where Prime describes how they've been stopped. His party has been stopped, and an official is holding them up, and they're trying to bribe him, and he won't accept the bribe. And finally, somebody gets behind him, and they push him. He falls over the guy and lands in the water, and they go on their way without paying their fine and go on where they're not supposed to be. And Clemens says, what fine Christian fun it is to duck a man who declines a bribe and stands to his duty. So again, he's really offended by the attitude of these people who are traveling in other cultures and being insensitive to the places where they're traveling. Again, this is a similar passage. Prime says, I'm afraid I must say, he's talking about riding over some Muslim tombs. And Clemens says, they were the tombs of somebody's fathers and mothers. Would you have desecrated them if they had been would he have desecrated them if they had been his own? And then we made a terrible scattering among a group of Greek women. He said, this terrible hero. So he really had no use for this guy. This is the one that's most chilling. They've gone into Jerusalem, and Prime is writing again. in Jerusalem, but who will ere long, God grant it be soon, sweep from the face of the earth every vestige of the religion of the camel driver of Mecca. And Clemens writes, the charity and the gentleness that Christ taught. So these people that he was traveling, it was a pilgrimage, and the people that he was traveling with were largely religious. It was intended originally that Beecher, Henry Ward Beecher, was supposed to be the celebrity clergyman on this voyage, and at the last minute, I guess, Beecher didn't go, but most of the people on the voyage were ostensibly there for religious reasons, and it was the contrast was too much for Clemens. It drove him crazy. An interesting thing about this was that later on, after Clemens published Grant's memoirs, which was a great success, he wanted to publish. He figured, well, they bought one general, they'll buy another one, so he wanted to publish the memoirs of McClellan. McClellan had written his memoirs and died, and McClellan's widow was in negotiation with Webster and Company to publish, Twain's own publishing firm, to publish McClellan's memoirs. And the executor of the estate was William Prime. So Clemens sent Charlie Webster, his nephew, in to do the negotiating. He said, it's offered to me by an old friend of mine, and also by the person in chief authority, who is an enemy of mine of long standing. So that was a great gift to get from Irene Langdon. The antenna gift came to us. Some of you may remember Bob and Kay Antenna many years ago. They dedicated Katie Weary Park one year over on the south side. Kay Antenna is the great niece of Katie Weary from Elmira, who was the Clemens family servant for 30 years. And they gave us a group of 90 volumes from their library that had come to them. The books had been in Clemens' library at Stormfield, and they were given to Clara when Clemens died. Or Clara gave them to Katie when Clemens died, and Katie passed down through her family, and they were given to us in installments over the 90s, back in the 90s. This is in a thing called The Great English Letter Writers, and in this case, Clemens is finally writing in his own books. This was his own book at Stormfield in his library, and this is a letter that Robert Louis Stevenson wrote to his mother, and it's he made the mistake, not knowing that Clemens was going to be reading it, of trying to sort of sermonize to his mother, and Clemens has a lengthy critique of Stephen's mistakes, basically. I'm not going to spend any time on that. This is from a thing called Love Among the Mistletoe, and you can see that Clemens was reading this in 1907, or inscribed it in 1907, and had read it because he's commented hogwash, but not atrocious enough to be first rate. And Alan Driven, who advised us on the Marginalia, he's the one that looked at all of these examples and identified it as Clemens' own handwriting and markings. He also had written an article about Clemens' library of literary hogwash. And Clemens' friends knew that Clemens liked examples of really bad writing, and they would send him things, and he would pass judgment. So this one made it, almost made it. It wasn't quite bad enough to be in the library of literary hogwash. Bad, but not quite bad enough. But the book that I always like to show people when I'm giving a class or talking to people is this thing. It's Pearl Island. And we don't really know who gave it to Clemens or if he bought it. We assume somebody sent it to him as a candidate for his library of literary hogwash. And also because it's It's reminiscent of Clemens' own books. You can see why people would think he'd be interested in it. It's an adventure story with two boys. They're actually young, about 19 young men who were shipwrecked, and it's about their adventures on an island. They're stranded on an island. So Clemens read the whole thing. I went through it. It's a 267-page book, and it has 268 markings of various and he went back to the flyleaf just in case you needed a warning. And the conversations in this book are incomparably idiotic. This is a passage which again is kind of reminiscent of Tom Sawyer. The boys, these guys are lost in a cave and they're wandering around in the dark and they come across a drop-off, and they describe dropping a boulder in to see how deep it is. And he says, I dropped a stone into the well, and from the length of time that elapsed before we heard the noise of its fall, in addition to the feebleness of the sound, we concluded it was a mile deep at the least. And Clemens says, if he'd dropped a church in it, he couldn't have heard it strike. They've also been talking about it raining, I think, outside or being overcast, and then they come to a hole in the cave where they can see out, and they talk about stars. So Clemens calls them on that. He's saying, stars visible? When the rain is still continuing. He made corrections like that throughout the book. The young men run into a dog appears on the island. And he's really upset that the dog is never described. So every time the dog appears, all that Castor will say is the dog. The dog came in, the dog did this, the dog did that. And Clemens will constantly be saying, what kind of a dog was it? What size, how big was it? He wanted something. And that's just the same page that I was showing you, a little blown there. Okay, this, they keep finding people on this island. It's not really a desert island, just all kinds of people keep popping up. But they're wandering around with this guy, and they're kind of lost. And one of the guys climbs a tree to see where they are, I think, is what happens. And he falls out of the tree. And at that paragraph down, about in the middle, he says, well, we ought to be thankful he was not instantaneously killed, Jack said. That was a great height to fall from. It must have been 35 feet. 5 years ago, I saw a sailor killed by a fall of 30 feet. And Clemens said, it's been done at 29. And then along the side, he said, these people are not to be damaged by falling on their heads. And then the last little piece he has, a person should have at least 7 hours of unbroken sleep every night. And Clemens says, quite right. And this is the final shot. The narrator says, startling indeed have been our adventures, some of which we may relate in another volume. And Clemens says, if you do, you ought to be flayed and then hanged. And that's the... now we get to actually the title of the talk. This is from Personal Recollections of Joan of Arc. And Clemens says, evidence is the bones of an opinion. The full quote, and Clemens is speaking as the sort of Louis de Camp, the character that he pretended to be in order to get Joan of Arc to be taken seriously. But I think you can kind of assume that it's Clemens' own opinion. And the full quote is, I think there's no sense in forming an opinion when there's no evidence to form it on. If you build a person without any bones in him, he may look fair enough to the eye, but he will be limber and cannot stand up. And I consider that evidence is the bones of an opinion. And what I've been showing you is a small part of the evidence that Clemens left behind. He left vast amounts of evidence. He has notebooks, manuscripts, the marginalia, some of which we've seen. There's marginalia all over the country, Clemens was writing constantly in or on something. And the personal correspondence, every time I hear an estimate, it goes up. You know, we're up to like 50,000 letters or something that Clemens left behind. That sort of evidence is becoming a thing of the past. This is a slide I made probably 2 or 3 years ago. It was in the New York Times, and it's, for all I know, the iPad can do this now. But, you know, the point is the kind of evidence, what is going to constitute evidence from this point forward. For people working and writing now, what are we going to have to work with when we want to do the kind of prying that we do with someone like Clemens? You know, with email has replaced correspondence, and word processing has replaced multiple drafts of hard copy manuscript. For Clemens, we have sometimes 3 or 4 typescripts of the same book that you can compare. You know, the thought process, the whole process of composition. So it's just, I just wanted to make the point that the kind of evidence we've been looking at is something that isn't going to be around that much longer. I had a quote from John Updike that I've been trying to find again. I can't remember exactly where it came from, but this was like 10 years ago, and he said he was riding the tired old horse of print literature into the sunset, which was kind of a, you know, for those of us who love that, love books, that becomes kind of a poignant thing. But it's clear that things are changing, and we aren't going to have this kind of evidence in the future. I have a lot more marginalia. There's a lot. I invite you to come down and make an appointment to see this stuff firsthand. There was a quote by, I think it was Frank Zappa, who said, he was talking about music critics. He said, writing about music is like dancing about architecture. And I kind of feel like that one showing. It's not quite the same experience as being in the room with the thing and actually seeing it. So I would encourage you to come down and have a look at this stuff. It's really, it's a different experience when you can actually be there with it. And I was going to say that I have a lot more stuff and I can share it with you at another time, but I'm kind of haunted by this. So I'll just say thank you. I can take a few questions too. Yep.
I have a question. One is, I was curious about your own personal background. Such as the Mark Twain Archivist. Is your background library, literature, English? And also, yes. You could tell me which is your favorite Mark Twain writing and why?
Oh. I was an undergraduate English major, and I'm a librarian. And in library school, I was interested in archives, so I did a little side thing in library school having to do with archives. And I was just fortunate enough when I came here that they needed someone to do this. So I'm from Elmira, but I had no particular interest in Mark Twain until I got this job. So yeah, and my favorite, what I always say when people ask me that question is, I really like Old Times on the Mississippi, which was not Life on the Mississippi. That was the book that came later, but Old Times on the Mississippi, which was serialized, I think, in the Atlantic Monthly. It's kind of a shorter. I just think Twain really is more consistent in that particular piece from beginning to end. It's more cohesive, I guess.
I have a couple of questions. At the time of Mark Twain, would you say that books were
I think, to answer your first question, I think these books were relatively expensive. We have examples of price lists for Twain's own books that were sold by subscription, and they were going for the lowest priced copy would be like $3.50, which was not cheap in 1875. And what was the second? I'm sorry, what was the second?
Was he writing these notes?
Oh, okay. Yeah, that's what I meant before. Like when you can see that he's crossing things out and making sure he gets things right, and who is he right? Who does he expect to see that? And there is a sense of audience. It's also true that sometimes he was writing for other people. There's some evidence that he began. He probably always had the habit of writing in the margins. Many people, I mean, it's not uncommon. You find marginalia from all kinds of different people writing books from that time period. But one of the things that he did do was specifically write when he was touring, on the lecture tours. He would get a book and mark it up and send it to Livy. So it was meant for her to read the comments. And some scholars have pointed out the places where those cross-out things that he does, there were times when he would cross it out as a joke and make it very readable so you could see what was underneath. That was part of the joke. And there were other times when he got it wrong, and that's when he did that thing where you can't possibly figure out what he originally meant. But he always seemed to have some sense that somebody was going to read it, and he wanted to get it right.
Was that a common thing that a lot of people did, or was it peculiar to Mark Twain?
As I understand it, it was very common, and there are a lot of books around. And the other thing that, when you talk about evidence, people are really interested in finding, so-and-so's copy, like Bacon's copy of whoever, like one great mind commenting on another great mind, and that is not uncommon. There are a lot of examples of that. But it's an interesting thing. I found an article when I was getting ready for this paper in the New York Times from last year. It was people bemoaning the fact that marginalia is going away. People talking about, where is this stuff? We aren't going to have this anymore. And the example they used was from the library, the Newberry Library in Chicago, and it was a Mark Twain book that they have in the Newberry Library. So he seemed to be perhaps more prolific in his marginalia than some other writers. I know Alan Gribben, who's done this, if you've ever seen his massive 2-volume set, he tracked down a lot of the marginalia. There's just a lot of it. And he's always been on the hunt for Twain's copy of Melville. Nobody's ever found any copy of Melville that Twain was known to have owned. So.
I'm just curious, do you think his sort of reluctance to admit his interest in Dickens had to do with, I know a lot of the writers at the time thought Dickens was overly sentimental and very heavily moralistic. I know Oscar Wilde said one of the characters' deaths was almost laughable in its extreme sentimentality, and there's extremely strong Christian overtones in all of Dickens' writing too. So, I mean, do you think that, and I get the sense that Dickens was looked at and sort of reluctantly enjoyed by a lot of contemporaries at that time. People thought it was overly sentimental and overly moralistic, at the same time it was good writing. So it's people were. Is that what, do you think it had anything to do with that? Or
I think it could have, and I think maybe what you're saying is what I told you, that person who I showed that one passage to, that was kind of their interpretation that Clemens was actually mocking Dickens' sentimentality.
Yeah.
I didn't get that from it myself, but yeah, I think there's, it's possible what you say, it probably could be true. His denials of Dickens were kind of wishy-washy. It was more like he didn't want anybody to really think that he was... He also, one thing that I read said that he did not want people drawing parallels or claiming that he was influenced by Dickens. He didn't want it to appear that he borrowed from Dickens. So that was another reason why he kind of played it down.
Mark, are there any examples where he took one of his own published works and then going through it a second or third time made commentary on his own writing?
Probably. We don't have any. I wouldn't be surprised, but I don't know offhand actually. He did a lot of. We have a lot of examples of him going through his manuscripts, his typescripts, and changing things. But no, I've never seen an example of it. Okay. Is that
Just one more. Is there any publisher who's published a book with his annotations? You know, for instance, if it were one of his, and you also in a E.B. White, others have done that one. Is there any book we can read where you see, other than coming to the library?
Not that I know of. Kevin McDonald, who you may have seen speak here, has one of the other sets of Leckie. And he's talked about, he wanted to combine our set and his set and publish that with facsimiles of all of the Marginalia. But yeah, I've thought of that myself. It would be nice to pull all that together and be able to see it.